Hi everybody. First, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here. What I'll do is... Higher? Thank you. What I'll do in my talk is talk about like a summary of recent advances that were like significant in our field over the last few years, and then discuss some remaining challenges and how, in our view, having a theory of consciousness can be actually very useful to address these challenges, to try to go further in that direction. And I'll explain some basic principles of the information theory of consciousness, and then move forward towards potential applications. Yeah, so as I mentioned, we've done quite a lot of work now with all the many actors are here in the room on brain function in coma, also anesthesia and sleep, and there has been significant advances in understanding on brain function in the vegetative state, and also the differences between vegetative state and minimally conscious state over the last few years. And using different techniques, being like PET scan, measuring brain metabolism like glucose consumption, or functional MRI, where you look at the regional consumption of oxygen and how it changes with activity, the Bolt signal, or electroencephalogram looking at brain waves and also connectivity in that kind of signal. We can see a number of studies that show some differences, at least at the group level, between vegetative state and minimally conscious state patients. So in general, what is found in these studies, being with resting state brain activity, you have different ways to quantify how the brain is active just at rest. Yeah, with PET it would be the consumption of glucose. Functional MRI would be how much the areas talk to each other, or even the amplitude of the local signal, amplitude of low frequency fluctuation. And then EEG would be like the power in different frequency bands. You can see that vegetative state patients, usually the brain are less active, especially as Stephen was mentioning, in frontal and parietal areas. And you can find good differences at the group level. In response to stimulation, that's another way to approach brain function. We see that in general, if you present some noxious or auditory stimulation in patient in vegetative states, then you will actually have a very local response, while in minimally conscious state, they will have a recruitment of many more brain areas. And again, you can look at that with PET scan, looking at the increase of brain activity, like oxygen consumption, for example, in response to stimuli, or you can look at that with functional MRI, like the Bolt response, or you can look at that with ERPs and also some connectivity in response to stimulation. And with all these techniques, we see that actually the recruitment of brain areas, higher order brain areas, not only primary sensory cortex, is typically higher in patients in minimally conscious state. And also some studies indicate a more backward connectivity, preserve feed-forward activity in these states. And then the third way you can approach, that's like simplified here, but brain activity in these patients is look at functional connectivity, so how brain areas talk to each other. And then here also we have a few studies using PET, functional MRI, or again EEG, showing that in vegetative state, not only the brain activity is higher, not only the recruitment, like the stimuli propagate further in the brain, and it's much closer to normal, but also when you look at the connectivity between the areas, they talk much more to each other. So that's something we understand better now. As I said, most of the time it's still toward the group level, but it's quite consistent across studies now. And then also another progress was the development of what we call active paradigms, so seeking for a response to command using brain activity, brain imaging, rather than the command at the bedside. The reason is a lot of these patients, they have also motor impairment. And so if you try to investigate consciousness level with a response to command, then you might have better chance sometimes with brain imaging, like asking, imagine something and then reading the brain. And so we had developed some tasks, and also the group from Nico has done now some other tasks
where we ask people to imagine playing tennis and they activate the motor cortex, imagine moving around a room, like traveling in space, and then you activate special areas. And then we could see in a number of patients now, even if it's a minority, they are able to do it. Some patients, even if they don't respond to command at the bedside, they can find some sign of activity in the motor cortex when you ask them to move, or in the spatial areas when you ask them to travel in space in their mind. Yeah. So that's quite also a significant advance, and indeed it works only in a minority of patients, and that's the patients where they're kind of the outliers with more normal brain activity, but that's something that is really nice. And I just wanted to mention, Adrian will talk about that tomorrow, but I think also this kind of study is very interesting that he has done now. It's not an active but more engaging paradigm, showing subjects a movie and looking at the different networks in the brain and how they react to different parts of the movie, especially like how, for example, when you have a lot of suspense in the movie, you have activation in executive areas. That's a quite elegant approach, which can work in some patients. Yeah, and can provide a lot of useful information. But then, despite all that, some challenges remain. And actually, I agreed a lot with what you said, Nico, about the problem we have is in between. The patients who have some kind of response like that, you will likely find normal EEG, normal PET, like a near normal brain activity, because this is quite demanding high-level tasks. But the problem we have is in the guys that, for example, they have minimal response to command at the bedside, or they track you, but then they don't have this high-level activation in response to mental imagery. And then what does it mean then to be minimally conscious? How is it like to be minimally conscious, and what extent of conscious level is preserved or not in these patients? The bedside, all the criteria we have for consciousness at the bedside, it's great we have that definition because we made a lot of progress with it, but sometimes it's difficult to interpret if someone is only tracking you, what is really going on in their mind? What does it mean? Or just like one of the patients Nico had was saying a word every 48 hours, something like that, and nothing else. So this kind of patient where you have no behavior except some like maybe island of brain activity that are preserved, what does it mean? Are they conscious or not? If you just say a word, what is it like to be like that? Is it like anything? So these intermediate states are challenging, and also there's a whole complication in the coma field that it's very difficult to have a report. In general, minimally conscious patients, you can't communicate with them. And vegetative state patients, sometimes you just miss the fact that they might be conscious because of all the problems we have to communicate with them, right? And I'll just show a few more examples saying that it's a problem that is actually quite strong, stringent, I don't know how to say in English, but important in coma, how to study coma patients. But it's actually a general problem also for other states. That is very difficult sometimes from behavior, or even for some islands of brain activity, if it's only a part of the brain that is preserved, to understand what it means, really. And that's how myself I also went to be more interested in getting to a theory, because then you think, okay, then maybe we need to understand general mechanisms of consciousness, and they're linked with the brain, and then maybe we can go further with these data. Or these patients, try to interpret better what we find as brain activity, what it means for experience. Although we're far from that, that's kind of, the topic I'm covering here. So some challenges, also that there's a lot of work that is now done, not only in coma, but also in seizures or sleepwalking, about what kind of the level of consciousness you have there. And what we thought before, complex absence seizure and generalized tonic-clonic seizures, that's unconscious, and then the others, that are conscious. Now, there's actually a lot of gray zone there, too. Like even in generalized tonic-clonic seizures, that's the one where people shake all their limbs and for several minutes. We thought they were completely unconscious. There's some studies showing by Blumenfeld and Joe that there's at least 10% that maybe track you or responds to one command, It's not so clear exactly what's going on. And also in partial complex seizures, you have 50% actually of people who are still able to have these minimal behavioral signs of consciousness. And if they don't recall it after, then maybe, you know, it's kind of difficult to see again what's going on there. Furthermore, seizures are kind of paradoxical because there is actually a lot of things going on in the brain. The brain here is a functional MRI study, and you have more activity when you're in the tonic phase of the seizure than normal. And that's absent seizure, and there's another recent paper by Blumenfeld too, showing that at least in part of them, your brain is more active than normal. So again, what does it mean? Are you completely unconscious there, or you just can't express it, you don't remember it, you know? There are lots of things that are very interesting to look at there. The reference is cut. But this is some work from Bassetti, and also that there is some interesting work now from Montplaisir and Zadra in Montreal about the sleepwalkers to show it, and actually there's also a lot of gray zone there. Sometimes the people they are behaving, you know, the sleepwalker from slow wave sleep, they move around, sometimes they go out of their room, they do stuff, right? But then at some points they don't remember or they can't tell you, and it's also like an interesting state where things are unclear. And there's a lot of nice work to be done, but at the same time, having here, like, behavior is tricky in the other way. They are actually doing much more than our minimally conscious patient, but then they tell you, well, I was not aware of it. And so, and then the last case I just cite here is some dissociative states, such as anesthesia, like ketamine. This is a very strange anesthetic because it's actually increasing a lot of higher frequency in the beta and gamma range in the brain, and then increasing theta too, but it's like this kind of intermediate state where people don't respond to commands. Some people think that actually you're unconscious there. Some other people think that actually you're conscious because you look, it's not like slow wave sleep. We don't really know what's happening there. And again, having some kind of unifying framework where you can think maybe about what kind of brain activity patterns are necessary to sustain consciousness is useful to get a whole picture of that, right? And just for dreams too, that's a recent study that I found very interesting that was done in the lab in Madison, where they were awakening people from sleep, non-REM and REM sleep. And what was new to me is that sometimes when you're like, it's a third in non-REM. You have 1/3 of the time when you're in slow wave sleep, you wake up and you have something to say, like typically thought, like, you know, dreaming of something. 1/3 where actually you have, no, this is the conscious, this is the no conscious experience part where you had nothing to say. But then there's a lot of times where actually I was conscious of something, but I don't remember, you know. And then that's also kind of a gray zone there. And in REM sleep, you would think, yeah, most of the time actually you report something, but sometimes you also either don't report and or you don't remember, but you think you were conscious. And in REM sleep, the brain activity pattern is actually very similar to wakefulness, right? There are some differences, like for example, a bit of more high frequency when you report something in REM than when you don't, and there's a bit less of theta in the back when you report something, but still, brain activity is very similar to wakefulness. So I mean, we've done a lot of progress thinking, okay, when you're conscious, typically your brain activity is higher, and then your brain areas communicate better, and then you're more responsive to stimuli. At the same time, there's a lot of gray zone that is challenging, and also like in a lot of different fields, right? Where having a unifying principle, like some kind of explanation that apply to everything, becomes very meaningful, if we could have it. So, the way to go for me, and at the same time we all have different advice, but it's just that having a unifying principle is something that I think would be very satisfying and useful, even for clinical purposes. Because if we had a good way to have a mechanism linking consciousness in the brain, then we could be very specific and potentially sensitive for diagnosis. But for that, then you're kind of entering the realm of theory and trying to think about, okay, what can we do to find the link between consciousness and the brain? And here, the approach that Giulio Tononi has in Madison and we're working on is actually a theory of consciousness that starts from consciousness itself. In our view, to be able to find the parts of the brain that sustain consciousness and what kind of activity in the brain is linked to that, or the physical support of that, the safest bet is actually to start from consciousness itself. To think about, okay, what are the fundamental properties of conscious experience? And from there, okay, then what kind of physical support could sustain it? But to us, it's the way to go, to first think about what are the fundamental properties of conscious experience, and then go in the, you know, as Stephen was saying, all the spike trains, all the different layers of the cortex and stuff like that. That's a very essential principle to guide you to try to find what is the link between brain activity and consciousness in all these data we have, you know, like in the huge amount of information we have. So integrated information theory of consciousness starts from consciousness itself and says, okay, if you look at it, okay, what is common to each and every conscious experience? Actually, there are lots of things that we think are not needed, such as, for example, visual perception. You can have an experience where there's no visual content, you know. Even interaction with the environment, you can actually, you know, dream and still have some experience. And here we actually define consciousness at what disappears during this experience. And postulates are what we think a physical system would need to have as properties to be able to generate it. And then there's a whole part of the theory which is also relevant to what I was saying when we say, okay, but what does it mean to be minimally conscious, even if you can't report? What does it mean to have like only a part of your cortex functioning? It's about the quality of the experience. And there I just take that example of, it's the spelling experiment, right? And you're trying, you're asked to say a letter, for example. What we assume is that actually, what we think is actually that this experience, as any others, would have a lot of different concepts in it. And how you could, for example, see if they are there or not is ask questions. So you would have the subject, that's the nose here, it's not very clear, and a mustache. Anyway, and it's looking at the screen, yeah? And then how you could say, how you could have the intuition that you would have so many concepts, and say that if you ask immediately after the subject, where there was there a screen, was there a room, there would be a lot of different concepts that would be present. Now the quality of experience is actually made by how the different concepts in quality space are generated. And the concepts actually themselves, they come from the brain activity, the activity of the different brain areas. But it doesn't come like from brain activity itself, it comes from what it means for the system, for the brain, if each brain area is activated or not. Anyway, this is a long story, but to make it short, the theory says that you can equate the experience to the structure of all the concepts that the system is generated, and the concepts, the quality is made on how the information is integrated, and how what particular information different parts of the system do generate. So there's an equation between experience and a conceptual structure that is made of integrated information from the different parts of the system, where different concepts would be, for example, that you would have a letter A in the corner, a top left corner, a screen, as I was saying, but a lot of negative concepts too. So the activity of brain areas that are silent matter too. Such as, for example, there is no giraffe, there is no face in there, and stuff like that. All that said, this is still work under progress, but it's to give a feel that there is not only the amount of integrated information, which is the level of consciousness, and also the quality, which is how the information is generated in the system. Yeah. And so, as I said, these are like main principles. I tried to make it short, but then the aim at the end, in my point of view, is also to go back to patients with that and to try to see, to make some predictions from the theory, to see what kind of brain activity patterns could be linked with consciousness, and in what are the properties of the system that are especially important, right? And there, for now, where we are at is actually doing some simulation on simple systems, but where we can get some general principles. And what the theory predicts then is that the kind of systems that are actually optimal for integrating information are systems that are both specialized and and integrated. So where you would have a rich connectivity, but each part of the system is doing something different. So integration and differentiation. That modular systems are not good for that. They would just split in different systems, but you wouldn't have a unified consciousness. That actually silent brains or epileptic brains would lead to a very low level of integrated information. And also that bistable dynamics like during sleep, when you're up and down, like everything firing and then everything silent, wouldn't be good neither. And yeah, maybe I'll skip that, but just to say that there's a, giving these predictions, we assume that so in the brains that would be unconscious, we would find either some very modular connectivity, some like very low level or high level of brain activity, or bistable dynamics like during sleep, with slow waves in the EEG, like you can find in different anesthetics or in during sleep. You can find that also more in vegetative state patients than in minimally conscious patients. And yeah, and at the end, also the approaches that are most promising to me to apply to patients is try to find some measures combining the two properties that we think are very important, which is integration and differentiation. And that's exactly what Marcello did. Is combining in one single number how the system is at the same time connected and differentiated, right? And that comes from these intuitions we were saying from the theory, that actually to generate a high level of integrated information, you need these two properties to be there in the system. If one is missing, then it's not good. You need both connectivity, but also specialization, differentiation in the system. But he will talk more about that. I just wanted to put that in the context. Conclusion, well, that's my opinion, but integrated information theory of consciousness, to me, from a few principles, I didn't have time to show a lot, but can explain a lot of different observations we have in the literature. And especially concerning the current neural correlates of conscious level, being in patients or sleep or anesthesia. And if we want to apply it to the data now, there's still a lot of work that is to be done to get it more precise and see again like what kind of layers or areas in the brain, what kind of connectivity would be involved, yeah? But if we want to approximate it now, we can already do this by searching for properties of brain state like information and integration. Well, what I was saying is that the theory requires system like high level of integrated information requires systems that have a lot of information in there, so a large repertoire of different brain states available, but also the fact that it's integrated, that you have a lot of causal interactions, what we call effective connectivity. So we think that actually you can already try to approximate the theory and try to combine some indexes where you look at both brain activity differentiation or specialization, and then connectivity, how they talk to each other at the same time. And then if you would do that in principle, you would do a great job to be very specific and sensitive to detect conscious level in brain damaged patients. Yeah, but as I say, that it's still ongoing work, and yeah, I'm looking forward to see the next few years. But Marcello will talk to you about beautiful data now, going like in the kind of direction I talked about.